Hi, my name's Chris. I'm a student at Suffolk County Community College, and today I want to talk about habitable zone exoplanets and where they might be and the ability to host or develop life. So, by habitable zone, what I'm really talking about is like on an Earth-like atmosphere, basically the range of distances from the star at which very necessary things like liquid water are able to exist. We're not too close to the star that there's a runaway greenhouse effect, but we're not so far away that everything freezes off. Kind of explanation on the common exoplanet detection methods. There's two main ones. First up is the radial velocity method. Now this uses the gravitational interaction between a star and an exoplanet around it, and how as they rotate around their common center of mass, the star is effectively sort of a wobbling motion, and this causes through the Doppler effect a modulation of the starlight in such a way that we can detect and measure here on Earth, and with which we can infer all kinds of data such as the planet's mass. Next up is the transit method. It's a little more straightforward. Just as a planet moves in between its host star and us, the distant observer, there's this drop in the brightness, the flux, and the drop is proportional to the size of the planet. So this allows us to obtain data on the planet's size. For my study, the primary data source was the NASA Exoplanet Archive, specifically their confirmed exoplanet table. This is a massive database. As of today, July 15th, there are 4,183 confirmed exoplanets, which is pretty incredible. It's an aggregate collection from various discovery programs, Kepler, TESS, WASP, CRO, KELP, etc. And there's a lot of great data filtering features and stuff to kind of narrow down your search window so you can find useful information you'd be interested in. To calculate the habitable zone limits themselves, I was using a model published by Kaparapu, amongst others, in 2013. And their model, assuming, again, a Earth-like environment, takes in the host star luminosity, effective temperature, and the mass of the exoplanet itself. And with that information, it can calculate the distances at which it estimates that the runaway greenhouse effect would kick off or liquid water would freeze off. And we use those as the inner and outer habitable zone limits, respectively. On the right, a general relationship between the temperature of the star and both the size of the habitable zone, but also its distance from that star. So up top, you have a very hot O-type or a B-type star, and you see it's a wide. That green band is very wide, but also very far away. But down below, you have a red dwarf where the habitable zone is much tighter and much closer to the star. And as I found in some of the resulting data, some of these habitable zones are actually, with these low mass stars, orbiting closer to the star than Mercury does our own sun, which is pretty wild. So using the filtering features on the NASA Exoplanet Archive to get all the parameters known that I would require for the habitable zone calculation, took that 4,000 plus number, that brought it down to 418 candidates, ran the calculations for all of these candidates, and got 27 habitable zone exoplanets identified. 12 of these are likely terrestrial based on their mass, which ranged from 1.11 to 7.6 Earth masses. And then the remaining 15 were likely gas giants from their masses, which ranged between 0.11 and 7 Jupiter masses. Obviously, gas giant not going to have a habitable surface environment that we can think of, but they're a promising area because if Jupiter and Saturn are any indication, these giant planets can be host to a very diverse population of moons, which would also be orbiting within the circumstellar habitable zone. And this can really increase the amount of potential extrasolar environments in which life as we know it can thrive. So it's worth mentioning. The terrestrial habitable zone planets I identified were mostly orbiting M-type red dwarf stars. It's possibly indicates some bias in my approach, just because these were largely discovered using the radial velocity method, which it relies on a given mass exoplanet to be able to tug gravitationally on the star enough that we can detect it. And a lower mass red dwarf star will have a greater tug exerted on it for a given mass exoplanet than a higher mass star. So it's possible that it's not a very indicative picture of what's actually going on, but it's what we have. Giant planets orbited a more diverse stellar population, mostly G and F type main sequence dwarfs, a couple of K and M types in there for good measure. What I did find was that 25 out of the 27 planets I identified were discovered using the radial velocity method. It only gives you a minimum mass estimate, not a concrete number. And that's just to do with the unknown inclination of the system relative to the observer here on Earth. And depending on how that system is inclined, we only may be able to detect a small component of that gravitational interaction. So if we're only detecting a smaller part and it's much larger, that would mean that the exoplanet is actually much larger than we originally estimated. It's also worth noting this approach with the habitable zone is not the only way to consider ways in which an environment could be habitable. Moons around these gas giants, as they are undergoing heating through the tidal interactions, they can put a lot of energy into the planet and really warm it up. And I mean, it drives the geologic activity on moons like Io in our own solar system, which orbits far outside of what we would consider the circumstellar habitable zone of the sun. So it's just a lot more potential outside of just that small band that we've already identified. And just in general, the benefits for studying this kind of stuff, there's no shortage of existential threats. On the near term, there's the global climate change. There's a small chance of an asteroid collision anytime. There's a couple of billion years down the road, the sun's moving off the main sequence, going into red giant stage. That's not going to be fun. And just any number of reasons why it may be conducive to our survival and longevity that we become a multi-planet species. And in order to do that, we have to identify these habitable extrasolar environments. And unfortunately, I will not be able to attend or virtually attend the Sensor Summer Institute. So if there are any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at the email on the screen. And thank you very much for your time and your interest, and take care.